BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays this year I've been talking to you guys about DB Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, we will examine a particular challenge question. What happened to the money that DB Cooper jumped with? Because DB Cooper more or less held a plane hostage, and he demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes as ransom in exchange for letting the passengers go. And then he parachuted into the night with the $200,000, but only $5,800 has ever been recovered. The jump occurred in 1971, and the money was found at Tina Bar in 1980, which is in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. But we will examine the question, what happened to DB Cooper's money? And throughout this recording, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. In fact, you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop something down below if you have something to say about DB Cooper, and specifically addressing this challenge question. And for the regular Cooper Friday viewers and listeners, I will talk about some different things at the end of the episode. A lot of people in the Vortex have been discussing the Dan Gryder videos that have been released on his personal YouTube channel. And there are 3 videos that he has done in a documentary-style series. They're user-generated documentaries, but he is talking all about DB Cooper and getting in touch with the FBI. And I wanted to make a direct response to those 3 videos, and I made it through the first one. It was 2 hours and 48 minutes long, and that took up quite a bit of time, so I was unable to get through all 3 of them, but at the end of this episode, I will play some responses to his first video. The third one is the most recent one that came out that a lot of people have been discussing in the DB Cooper groups. So please stay tuned to the end. But there's a particular article that was written in the Boulder City Review that is discussing some possibilities about what happened to DB Cooper's money, because he boards the plane using the name Dan Cooper, and he sets up this whole ruse, perhaps, about how he has a bomb. He's going to detonate the bomb if he doesn't get $200,000, and then he wants the money and the parachutes. He asked for 4 parachutes, even though he didn't need 4 parachutes. But most people think that this was done because he wanted to show that he either was going to take a hostage or create the illusion of taking a hostage. And I think that that was just common sense on the part of DB Cooper. If he only asked for 1 parachute or the 2 parachutes, meaning like 1 standard chute and 1 reserve chute, then people would know that he is not going to jump with a hostage. So at the very least, he created the possibility of jumping with a hostage so people would take his threats more seriously. But a big question is, what happened to the money? Because one of the things that I've talked about a lot here on Cooper Friday is the money was not found in circulation. And one of you guys in the comment section was just challenging me on that by saying that, hey, this was 1971. They didn't have computers, and after a certain point, they're not going to be looking for the money anymore. When people are depositing $20 bills into the bank in 1971, they weren't going through any type of computer system. Were people actually looking for the serial numbers on these bills at all? And I would think the answer is no. But let's look at this article called B.C. Manpen's New Theory About Famed Skyjacking. And yes, when I hear the name Boulder, I often think of Boulder, Colorado, but Boulder City is, of course, in Nevada, as made famous by the movie La La Land. Let's have a read. One Boulder City man believes the Silver State has more of a connection to the infamous DB Cooper case than just the fact that a Nevada resident has come up with a new theory about the mysterious skyjacker's identity and how he managed to elude officials for more than 40 years. And yes, as you see, this is a little bit of an older article, but I wanted to discuss the theory all the same. It's now been over 50 years since the DB Cooper skyjacking. Gregory Hall, a retired FBI special agent and former Army paratrooper, believes officials should have been looking for Cooper just north of Reno, Nevada, instead of focusing their efforts in southern Washington. Already, this is a hard sell for me. I know we're going to be talking about the money, but when I look at the possible drop zones for DB Cooper, as an amateur, as a newcomer to this case, I don't even think he jumped in Oregon. I think all of the evidence is indicating that he jumped over Washington State. So when people are talking about how he would have jumped near the Columbia and landed in Oregon, I think those are hard sells. But let's keep going. The Boulder City resident recently released a theory in an article he wrote and published on his website. He said that he came up with his ideas about the skyjacking by looking at the caper from a military perspective. Okay, so the military perspective is guiding him to say that DB Cooper jumped over Reno, or that northern Nevada. Let's say, he didn't say Reno yet, northern Nevada. And there are other military people out there who say things that are very much to the contrary. They think that DB Cooper was Ted Braden. In fact, Ted Braden's old military buddies immediately thought that DB Cooper was Ted Braden once they evaluated the findings, and he would have jumped over southern Washington. Though he doesn't come up with a specific suspect, he said that his theory offers practical details of how the skyjacking could have been executed and the type of person capable of doing it. Even before I got on the internet and did any research, I put together an OP plan, an op plan. It only took 15 minutes. It was so academic. Now, you are going to find this from time to time. Someone who's putting together a plan in 15, 20 minutes. It's like in the Zodiac Killer mystery when someone makes a list of suspects. Okay, well, this is the short list of suspects who could have done it. All right, I'm going to narrow it down. Aha, I found the killer. And you could do the same thing in the Jack the Ripper mystery. And I do a segment every Monday about the Zodiac here on Black Box Online Radio. I also have lots of episodes about Jack the Ripper. People do this stuff all the time where they're like, all right, they're trying to present themselves as using a no-nonsense style approach, but in all reality, does that not create room for assumptions? Hull said that the operational plan put a military spin on the skyjacking, using information from his experience with an airborne parachute operation. The plan involves a series of steps, one of which was the need for a false insertion or diversion prior to the actual jump. According to Hull, Cooper's diversion was so successful that people have been searching for him or remnants of his jump in the wrong location since November 24th of 1971, the evening when the man parachuted out of a Seattle-bound Boeing 727, wearing a business suit and sunglasses, and demanding $200,000 in cash. He believes people may have overlooked some key points that could have helped the case, as the loose ends fit nicely into his hypothesis. The basic premise of Hull's theory is that the man identified as DB Cooper was an active-duty military member, about 40 years old, stationed outside of the U.S. when the caper was committed, but he was visiting home for Thanksgiving on the holiday. See, now this is the more meat and potatoes aspect of the theory, where we can look at something that I can actually evaluate. You're going to talk about DB Cooper jumping north of Reno. That's a very hard sell. Now, if you want to say that this is how somebody committed the skyjacking, this is how somebody was able to throw off a true diversion, the stuff on the plane seems like it's going to be a little bit far out, but this guy, whomever Gregory Hull is talking about, he committed the caper. He committed the DB Cooper skyjacking because he was on leave from the military while he was stationed out of the country. He was only home for a short amount of time for the Thanksgiving holiday, and then he was going to go back. So, let's continue with the article. As an experienced paratrooper, he easily survived the jump and was well versed on the Boeing 727 and knew the rear staircase could be used as a jumping off point during the flight, since it had been done in Southeast Asia prior to the skyjacking. Nothing wrong with that. Though his information was not known to the general public, commercial pilots and Federal Aviation Administration officials have talked about it. Additionally, he was familiar with the Seattle area and could have been stationed at Fort Lewis or the McCoy Air Force Base. So those would indicate that DB Cooper is going to be jumping closer to Washington State, right? After landing safely, Cooper would have stashed the ransom money and hitchhiked into town, explaining that he was on a business trip and that his car had broken down. In the morning after renting a car, he would have retrieved the ransom money and proceeded home to visit his family for the holiday and ship the money to his overseas duty assignment. Now we are finally getting to the question, what did DB Cooper do with the money? So he lands somewhere. Anywhere. Let's even take Nevada out of the equation. Let's say he lands in southern Washington or northern Oregon. He stashes the money, buries it somewhere. This is even one of the things that was discussed in the book Into the Blast, that Cooper could have jumped with a shovel. When what Cooper had in the small bag that no one knows the contents of to this day, it actually could have been a small foldable shovel or collapsible shovel. Foldable, I think, is perhaps a better term. And he could have dug a small hole, buried some of his items, including the money, and then he pretended to be lost in the woods. Now, the businessman angle is going to be hindered by one thing. DB Cooper wouldn't be able to show off his black tie with the mother of pearl tie pin, and that's going to damage his business attire a little bit, but I mean, that would have hindered Cooper during the jump because the tie would have been flapping in his face, and that's why some people think that DB Cooper took off his black tie and left it on the plane, because he simply thought that it was just unnecessary to keep for the jump, and it could have caused some type of complication if he had been wearing it. I mean, he could have put it in his pocket, right? But maybe he wanted the space for something else, or maybe Cooper simply did not care. But Cooper buries the money, and then he has it shipped overseas to his duty assignment, where he was stationed in the military. He has a box shipped overseas, and that had the $200,000 in it. What do you think about this theory? And let's keep going with the article. For the remainder of our overseas deployment, we know we can use money off base with very little chance of the U.S. government being able to track the bills down, Hall wrote in his article. DB Cooper, step out of the shadow. Hall's friend and neighbor Richard Stevens, a retired colonel and former Army Ranger and battalion commander in the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, says that he finds this theory completely plausible. Well, this is the stuff that I'm going to be discussing in the Dan Gryder response, which I'm not going to lie to you guys. It goes over some of the information that we've talked about before on this channel in regards to Richard McCoy, but this is one of the largest myths of the case, just that DB Cooper could not have possibly survived the skyjacking. I think DB Cooper survived the skyjacking. I think he survived the jump, and I have not seen an ounce of evidence that would indicate that DB Cooper was not able to survive the jump. But that begs the question of what happened to the money. And to all the people out there who think that DB Cooper died during the jump, why wasn't the money found? Now, there is something that I heard on the DB Cooper Sleuth channel that is run by Ryan Burns, but it was actually a comment from one of his guests named Chris Cunningham, who said that here is a possibility. What if Cooper lost the money during the jump? The $200,000 gets blown away, and then somebody finds it in the woods, and then that person decided to take out 2 or 3 bundles, however many bundles they had, and put them at Tina Bar. They were manually buried at Tina Bar by someone who found the money because they knew what it was. They figured out what it was. They were like, this is the money from the DB Cooper skyjacking, because they had been following the news. And then other people would find the money, and then they would think, oh, well, this must be from DB Cooper. He died during the skyjacking. Then the people who found the money would have the opportunity to spend it, or that they wouldn't be looking for it. I think that is a theory that has some strong components to it. There's some merit to that type of thinking. But the question is that, when would that have taken place? When would they have found the money and still think about DB Cooper? Would that be 9 years later? Because the rubber bands on the bills and that were found at Tina Bar should have been way more heavily degraded than what was found. And some people talk about this in the comment section. They say that when you have a rubber band in your kitchen drawer for 2 years, it starts to fall apart, and you're saying that something has been buried in the sand for 9 years, and you're still going to have it intact. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. Other people think that DB Cooper survived the jump. He kept the money. He was able to spend the money. Maybe he spent it overseas. Maybe he used it in a casino. And that he was the one who went back to Tina Bar, and he buried the money himself at Tina Bar for a particular reason. One of the flight attendants on the plane was named Tina Mucklow. It could have been paying homage to her, or he could have done that because he wanted somebody to find it, and just thinking that it's letting the world know that he was still alive, that he did indeed survive the jump. And one theory that was put forward by one of you guys was just that, okay, DB Cooper thought that if somebody finds this, they deserve to have some of the money because they figured out a portion of the story. And there's even a theory out there that I've talked about during the Kenny Christensen episode, when DB Cooper may have landed at Tina Bar, and he did that to mark the drop zone. But what do you think? What happened to DB Cooper's money? Let's continue with the article here. The mystery of what happened to DB Cooper has captivated Americans since it happened, with numerous movies, television shows about the case being made, including a two-part special on the History Channel that was released. Though Hall's theory was not included in the History Channel's program on the caper, there was a book that was written by Tom Colbert, an investigative journalist. Yeah. They happened to coincide with the clearance that he received from the FBI to share his thoughts. As a retired agent, Hall has to submit everything he writes for pre-publication review to ensure that sensitive or confidential information or investigative processes are not disclosed. Oddly enough, the review, which is only supposed to take 30 days, took 6 weeks. Ironically, just last week, this is 8 years ago, the FBI announced it was administratively closing its investigation on the 45-year-old case. Still, Gregory Hall said he hopes that anyone who reads this article and knows someone who might fit the profile created should call the FBI Seattle field office so that DB Cooper can finally be identified and the case can be closed. I would like to thank Hallie Bernstein, the author of that article for the Boulder City News, but there are a couple points here. Firstly, this thing about the drop zone over Reno, Nevada is going to be very, very difficult. And I have to give credit to Ryan Burns when he does a very big demonstration on his channel talking about the pressure bump, and DB Cooper walking down the aft staircase would have been felt by the cabin crew and so on. And the pressure and the weight in the plane would have been recognized, and people would have been completely aware that DB Cooper was going down the staircase. And this ties into some wider theories that people have, because, Gregory Hall is not the only person to accuse DB Cooper of jumping over Nevada. For example, Harriet Suchet thinks that DB Cooper did indeed jump over Reno, but instead it's tying into the theories about how DB Cooper was hiding in a secret compartment and he jumped later on. And I get the point about how you're saying, well, he could have created a diversion. Does he go down the aft staircase, walk back up, hide in the secret compartment, and then jump over Reno? Well, then they would have experienced additional weight distribution and pressure bumps and so on. So I think that the clearest and simplest explanation is DB Cooper jumped over southern Washington. Now, Dan Gryder will provide a solid explanation about why he thinks that DB Cooper lost the money, and as previously stated, his suspect is Richard Floyd McCoy, so he's going to rework this into a theory that DB Cooper lost some money, and then McCoy is going to try another skyjacking later on where he's going to get busted. But I'm going to be talking about that in this segment that I'm going to play for you in just a second, where I respond to Dan Gryder's first video documentary on the DB Cooper case. But thank you for listening to this first segment on Cooper Friday, and I also really, really want your challenge question. What do you think happened to the money? In the past, I thought just that Cooper lost the money and it was never found, and then some of it was bouncing around the Pacific Northwest because of natural elements, because of natural reasons, and then some of it ended up at Tina Bar. We're talking about going through the Lewis River, maybe even being dragged by something to the Columbia River, through the Columbia River, up to Tina Bar. Now, I'm leaning much more toward DB Cooper's able to keep the money, and it was just spent, and the money was manually placed at Tina Bar, because, what if Gregory Hall's completely right? What if DB Cooper took the money out of the country, and he exchanged it for foreign currency, and he was using it abroad? And I think that the other theory that really came to mind is just that, what if it was used in the casinos, and then it's immediately shipped somewhere else? So I think that is something it's something we can discuss, but that's very, very assumptive. You'd have to make the assumption that, number one, Cooper was a regular patron of casinos, that he was a gambler. I don't think that we have enough information to say that. As of now, I'm going with the theory that DB Cooper survives the jump, he was able to use the money, and it was spent, or it was distributed in some way by his own accord, and someone manually buried the money at Tina Bar. What do you think about that? Put your ideas in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. And I'm going to play the segment in response to Dan Gryder's video documentary on DB Cooper and the suspect Richard Floyd McCoy. Plane fly to Mexico, but that was not possible, so they agreed upon Reno, Nevada. Then somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, he parachuted out into the night, never to be seen or heard from again. to everyone's satisfaction. Now, there are going to be people like Dan Gryder who have a suspect like Richard McCoy who are going to say that, well, of course, DB Cooper interacted with other people. Of course, DB Cooper was seen or heard from again. Richard McCoy had a family. He was married with kids. He was a student at Brigham Young University. And then he just went on to live his life for a little while. But Richard McCoy has his own place in the true crime world because he attempted his own skyjacking. And even though it is often listed as an unsuccessful skyjacking, the actual components of the skyjacking that McCoy did seem like they were more or less successful. He got away with it for a little while, but ultimately Richard McCoy was tracked down. He was apprehended. He went to jail, escaped from jail, and then he was killed in a shootout while he was more or less on the run. There's an enormous story out there, and there's an excellent video on the FBI files, from the FBI files, about Richard Floyd McCoy. But there is also an interview here on this channel, Black Box Online Radio, where I interviewed Ryan Burns of the DB Cooper Sleuth channel, and he was talking all about his observations about Richard Floyd McCoy and why he thinks that McCoy was not DB Cooper. So there's some contrasting information. But let's look at some of the points that were put forward in the 3 videos that were done by Dan Gryder. And I should point out that if someone has not seen these videos yet, they are available on Dan Gryder's YouTube channel, which is called Probable Cause. The full name of the YouTube channel is Probable Cause Dan Gryder. And the first one was 2 hours and 48 minutes long. And I did make it all the way through. And I did so because of an odd reason. On Mondays, I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, and I just happened to have watched a Zodiac video last weekend that was 2 hours and 48 minutes, and that was from the Paranormal Files. It was called We Found the Zodiac Killer. Spoiler alert, no, they did not. But I was just really caught by that particular time signature, so I decided to make it all the way to the end, as well as looking at his FBI update. So, with a suspect like Richard Floyd McCoy, there is a very different aspect to this case, because McCoy was apprehended, he went to jail, and he ultimately passed away. And this is going to be something that really is different, because what Dan Gryder is first trying to do in his videos is to talk about this narrative that has been put forward by the FBI that DB Cooper could not have survived the jump. DB Cooper could not have gotten away with that without serious injuries. DB Cooper would have been incapacitated, and they would have either found him broken, or he landed in a crater somewhere, and he's just never been found. And Dan Gryder really wanted to challenge that, because he's pointing out that there are numerous ways that DB Cooper could have survived the jump. Firstly, most likely he knew where he was. He knew where the plane was going. And Richard McCoy, according to Gryder, would have had knowledge of the Victor flight routes that Boeing 727 would have used, and DB Cooper would have also wanted to jump from a 727 because it had the aft staircase that would have opened from the rear exit, and he would have been able to jump out and parachute into the night, and he would have been jumping into inclement weather. There is a point of contention, though, because Dan Gryder was playing this clip from the FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, and he played it over and over again when he said that he didn't think that DB Cooper could make that jump without getting injured, and he's just trying to point out that this is an unlikely scenario, and that DB Cooper couldn't have made the jump without getting injured. He played the clip over and over in part 1. But I would just like to ask you guys, do you think that DB Cooper could have made his jump, landed, without getting injured? And you're going to be surprised at my answer, no. Because there's an enormous difference between injured and debilitated, incapacitated, injured beyond repair, and of course dead. And yes, of course, people like Ralph Himmelsbach and Larry Carr were pushing the narrative that DB Cooper did not survive the jump. Those two gentlemen were from the FBI. But injured, I mean, when you have such a vague statement and you're going to try and use it as a gotcha moment, no, I don't think that's a gotcha moment. DB Cooper could have highly probably sustained an injury. It's quite probable that DB Cooper could have sustained some type of injury after landing, especially when he didn't have the proper gear to the best of our knowledge. Think about what the word injured means when you're going to talk about things like bruises or cuts or just a rough landing on his ankles or something to that effect. Now, do I think that DB Cooper died during the jump? No, absolutely not. Because I think if DB Cooper died during the jump, then they would have found more physical evidence. They would have found more things that were left behind. I just wanted to point that out there, but I would really love your responses to that particular challenge question. And I have to give some credit to Dan Gryder. He is a skydiver, and he did multiple jumps during his video presentation, and he was trying to demonstrate certain things while he was jumping from a plane at, roughly the same feet, but specifically with the same amount of money. DB Cooper had $200,000 with him in $20 bills. $200,000 made up of $10,000 $20 bills. And he recreated this for the video, and what he wanted to point out was if DB Cooper had jumped, he most likely would have been holding on to the money, and it would have been impossible for him to hold on to the money all the way to the ground. The money would have been blown away, again according to Dan Gryder. This becomes the foundation for the McCoy skyjacking, because Richard McCoy skyjacking came after DB Cooper. And you have Dan Gryder putting forward this claim that, all right, Richard McCoy was a Vietnam vet. He knew a lot about airplanes. He was a criminology student at BYU. He wrote this paper on what are the ways to stop skyjacking? How and why can we stop skyjackings? And he came to the conclusion that there really is no security defense against skyjackings at the time. Therefore, he could have concocted his own plan to commit a skyjacking and get the money. And Richard McCoy asked for $500,000, not $200,000 like Cooper did. That's more than twice the amount of money. And this is a very, very big theory that has been shared by multiple people in the vortex, putting forward their claims about how and why they think DB Cooper committed the skyjacking, as well as a follow-up attempt. The people who have McCoy as a suspect say he lost the money the first time, therefore he created a second skyjacking to try and get even more money, twice the amount to be precise, $200,000 going to $500,000, more than twice the amount. So with this particular type of theory, I would be completely listening to you. I would be completely hearing you out, except for the fact that in one of Dan Gryder's videos, he threw in a particular statement, and that was that DB Cooper seems to have made some mistakes, and Richard McCoy corrected them. Isn't it odd that Richard McCoy was able to correct all of the mistakes that DB Cooper made, and I'm just sitting back and listening to this as some guy in the audience and thinking, whoa, goodness, no, absolutely not. And these are the reasons that I've always had a problem with Richard McCoy as a DB Cooper suspect. He left his notes in the terminal, which he needed for the skyjacking. He was completely nervous and shaking the whole time. He wore a terrible disguise, whereas DB Cooper just wore the famous wraparound sunglasses, right, that you see in the composite sketches. And Richard McCoy used eating candy as a vice, and I can kind of halfway give this one to Dan Gryder, and halfway not, because DB Cooper famously smoked cigarettes and he drank bourbon when he was on the plane, bourbon and soda. But with Richard McCoy, he was just eating candy, and that seems like what he did with stress. Now, I can give McCoy credit for the fact that he can put candy wrappers into his pocket, whereas the cigarette butts were left behind. And, I mean, that seems like something that would be a little bit more practical, but also Dan Gryder was trying to use this as a strong point for McCoy being DB Cooper, saying that McCoy was reportedly never a smoker and he did not drink alcohol because he was a Mormon, so nobody's going to suspect this guy to be sipping bourbon and soda and smoking cigarettes on the plane on Flight 305. Now, you can kind of put that where you want and kind of give credit where you think the credit is due. But as far as the building up the case for Richard McCoy as a DB Cooper suspect, Dan Gryder took a very odd turn when he said that it's almost as if the FBI knows that it was McCoy. The FBI knows who committed the DB Cooper skyjacking. The difference is that the reason why they haven't made a public statement is they lost all the evidence. This is a cover-up. This isn't some type of wacky conspiracy. It's a cover-up. I mean, on this channel, that does meet the definition of a conspiracy. Two or more people hiding the truth, usually for a malicious reason, but not purely. Conspiracy, cover-up, whatever you want to call it. That's what happened. DB Cooper was McCoy, and this just happens to have been a case of the evidence being poorly handled, and they know who did it. They're just not coming forward with it. All right. I experience this all the time in the true crime world because I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer and about Jack the Ripper here on Black Box Online Radio, and I'm never impressed when someone is trying to play the card of, yeah, it's the prime suspect. It's just that we don't have the evidence to convict him. But yeah, it's the prime suspect. They probably just were missing a piece of evidence, therefore this person got away with it. They will say this about the Zodiac suspects, they'll say this about the Jack the Ripper suspects. We are going back to 1888 on this one, and it's the same narrative getting shared time and time again. And I've never been impressed with that because we have stories like the Golden State Killer case that are busted wide open, and it turns out it's someone who was much lower on the rankings and lower on the totem pole of suspects than someone else, or than the higher ranking suspects, and it turns out it's D'Angelo. And I had never even heard of Rex Heuermann before he was arrested for being the Long Island serial killer, yet there were prime suspects and widely discussed suspects online. He was not one of them. So with DB Cooper, I think that it's going to be the same story. All of this attention comes on McCoy, and then people are just going to have to simply admit that you cannot play that card of, oh yeah, it's the prime suspect. They were just missing the critical piece of evidence that would have convicted him. So I'm not impressed with that type of thinking. But Dan Gryder expanded upon this, and he interviewed multiple members of McCoy's family, and he talked to people who were following the case. He interviewed other DB Cooper sleuths, as well people such as Bruce Smith, author of DB Cooper and the FBI, Ryan Burns of the DB Cooper Sleuth channel, which I just mentioned, and the Ryan Burns interview was in the third segment. But as far as the interviews and what I took away from them was, there's another element to the McCoy theory that I had not talked about a lot here on Black Box Online Radio in the past, that I have not talked about a lot in the past, and that is the role of McCoy using his wife as an accomplice. And it's laid out like this in Dan Gryder's videos. Number one, McCoy commits the DB Cooper skyjacking, and he loses the money. McCoy commits the second skyjacking, and he's able to keep the money, and the whole time, his wife is an active participant in this. She is more of someone who's dealing with the orchestration aspect of this, and it was stated that Richard McCoy's grenade that he used to hold up the plane with, like during the McCoy skyjacking, he didn't have a briefcase bomb, he had a grenade, and he had a gun that wasn't loaded. And the grenade was a dud. And that's why they believe that DB Cooper's bomb was a dud. And the plan was to get the money. The plan was only to get the money, because it was just about committing a victimless crime where no one was going to get hurt, but they were just going to obtain the money that they could use for the family. Mom and Dad were involved in this together, and that's it. Richard McCoy was a Vietnam vet who was experiencing financial hardship. He was not able to do a lot with his education. He was studying at BYU, but he didn't have a bright future ahead of him with the type of education that he was pursuing, so they launched a plan to get hundreds of thousands of dollars from these skyjackings. But here's the problems that I have with that theory. Number one, we do not know with certainty that DB Cooper's briefcase bomb was a dud. I mean, I said in the past I thought it was absolutely a dud. Now I'm leaning toward more and more of this being a real bomb. Point number two, we aren't certain that DB Cooper lost the money. We aren't certain that DB Cooper wasn't able to hold on to the money because, as other people have put forward, like Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins, and as well as perhaps other people, this is just the first one that came to mind, in their book, they just stated that DB Cooper could have tied the money to himself and the money was hanging down first, and then he wouldn't have had to been holding on to it the way that Dan Gryder would have imagined that. And there are reasons why Dan Gryder says this in this video, why he thinks DB Cooper was doing that, but that's just one possibility. Lots of people have DB Cooper suspects whom they claim, and they claim that their suspect was able to keep the money. So that's something that I also want to stand by, and just want to point out that there's a certain level of not exactly assumptions but interpretations of the evidence that do not appear to be completely certifiable, and there are other possibilities. Now, in terms of his background and his knowledge and his expertise, I give Dan Gryder some credit. He's a skydiver. I am not. He jumped out of the plane to recreate the DB Cooper heist. I did not. But there's one scene in his video where he interviews Bruce Smith, author of the previously mentioned book DB Cooper and the FBI, and he's talking to him, and he asks him about, have you ever jumped before? Are you a skydiver? And Bruce Smith says no, and it's almost done in a way that's meant to discredit Bruce Smith, and I don't think that that's acceptable. Absolutely not, because I talk a lot about serial killers on this channel, like the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper, as well as countless other serial killer episodes. I have almost 2,000 episodes of Black Box Online Radio. I invite you to check some out. And I've never accepted that card that, well, you didn't do it yourself, therefore you can't talk about it. What, people can't talk about unsolved mysteries because they weren't the criminal themselves? I mean, and I know that this is about skydiving, not criminal behavior, but it's the same concept. Oh, you've never been a serial killer, you can't talk about serial killers. You never pulled off a heist, you can't talk about heists. And then we get to, you've never gone skydiving, you can't talk about the DB Cooper skydiving attempt. Not acceptable. I do not accept that, because you're looking at it from the insider perspective versus the outsider perspective. And another thing that Bruce Smith can do, as well as people like me can do, is we can talk and listen to people who are jumpers, who do go skydiving, who are from the military, and they are able to share what they think with us. And I did particularly notice that when Dan Gryder was going through his video and he's recreating the DB Cooper skydiving attempt, I keep saying skydiving, the DB Cooper jump, hardly going skydiving when you've just committed that criminal heist. It was a skyjacking, and he chose to jump off the back half staircase. But when someone is doing that, they often do it during the daytime. Earl Cossey also recreated the jump during the daytime, and you even see this in the movie from 1981. DB Cooper goes down the back staircase during daylight hours. Even if you look at the book cover for Into the Blast, you can see DB Cooper jumping during the daytime, and this is something that is just simply not the way Cooper did it in real life. And I always go back to Staff Sergeant Mike Davis, who said that the people who jump at night, the way that DB Cooper did, are the military. That is military behavior. And, that even just goes to show that even if someone has been skydiving, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have just gone skydiving in the same way that DB Cooper would have, or been trained the same way that DB Cooper had been trained. So there are just going to be all these types of differences and conflicting elements and additional pieces of information. And until we know who DB Cooper is, we don't know what his educational background was. But I'm going to come back to the whole original point. You can talk about something, even if you haven't done it yourself firsthand. Insider perspective, outsider perspective, these things exist in the research world. I told you guys that the video is out, called DB Cooper FBI Update, and I would like to look at some comments that have been written on that. And again, this is mostly focusing on the DB Cooper suspect, Richard Floyd McCoy. The FBI interviewed McCoy and collected handwriting and fingerprint samples. A handwriting expert concluded that McCoy wrote the note that was left on the plane. A fingerprint specialist also found a match and a latent print on the plane and a print from McCoy's military service record. However, McCoy was not detained because he denied involvement and didn't match the physical descriptions provided by flight attendants. WTF. Well, I simply think that some of that is just simply going to be untrue, that McCoy's fingerprints matched or something like that. I'm just saying, otherwise this would be a slam dunk. And I'm really not trying to put anybody down or anything like that. I'm just genuinely expressing some doubt and skepticism. And the next one reads, I actually watched this event unfold in Portland. I had flown into Portland to have Thanksgiving with my mother. When we were kept on the plane for an extended period. We were not told why. I could see the event unfold in the plane next to ours through the window. There were a number of police vehicles on the tarmac below, and someone moving back and forth in the plane. Little did I know during the next AM hours on the news. Great sleuthing work. The FBI should be ashamed of their actions. And that was from YouTube user Evan Reeser. And I mean, I always appreciate people sharing their first-hand experiences. And this will bring us to an end of this week's Cooper Friday. Thank you for listening to that messy segment about Dan Gryder's videos, and I'm still going to be working through with them, and perhaps I will do a larger follow-up in the future. I just wanted to share some of my initial responses to the entirety of video 1 as well as video 3, but I'll try to make a neater version of that for a future Cooper Friday. But the thing that I want to talk to you guys about now is really, I want to know what you guys think about the money. What happened to DB Cooper's money? What happened to the money from the skyjacking? Where did it go? Did he lose the money? Did he get to keep the money? What do you think happened? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. I am your host, Black Box Ned, and you guys can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. I have a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. My Facebook name is Ned Dahan, and you can use the name BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram and TikTok. I mostly just put out reels on TikTok, but I am on Instagram. That's all for me now, and until next time.